Good morning, everyone. We will begin at 11 on the dot. We're still waiting for people to trickle through to join us for the session today. Okay, it is 11 on my side, so I'd like to welcome everybody to session 3 of this 4-part series called Queering Social Survey Research, Reimagining Measurements of Sex, Gender, and Sexuality in South Africa. This series is the handiwork of Sthembiso Pollen Mkhize, a junior researcher at the Gauteng City-Region Observatory, and his colleague Melinda Swift, stemming from the work that they did on a quality of life survey. Included in this effort is Julia Descartes of Site Savers, Tara Polsamato of Social Surveys, Africa's Social Impact Insights, and Pierre Berard of the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender at the University of Pretoria to co-create the series. Nalini Ngwenya, who will provide technical support as well as notify us on the house rules, and myself, Wisam Kanazi, who will take on the role as the chair of today's session, as well as an observer and note taker to ultimately produce a publication based on this seminar series. Sthembiso is the project lead, and the rest of the team have worked with him to bring these conversations to you. Naledi, over to you, please.
Thank you, Vuyiswa, and welcome everyone. Firstly, would like to let you know that the session is being recorded to facilitate the reporting process, so please know that this will happen today. And please ensure that your microphone is on mute unless you are unmuted by the chair to participate in the discussion. Please use the chat box to write your questions or comments to the speakers. If you would like to contribute to the discussion, please click on the participants icon and select raise hand, which will alert the chair that you would like to make a point. Please share your name and affiliation after the host has unmuted your microphone. Please select lower hand once you have spoken, and your microphone will be muted. Finally, would also like to note that the conversation today may touch on aspects of queer lives and identities, which will be sensitive and personal. We will do our best to create a safe space and welcoming space. We invite you to co-create the space, and let's also remember that queer lives can be lives of joy and celebration too. Now we'll hand over to Vuyiswa, who will take you through the rest of today's session. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Naledi. So the first two editions unpacked the importance of collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data, the dangers of ignoring the SOGI variables, and the challenges and best practices of capturing complex identity phenomena in social surveys. The third edition today covers the practical side of the conversation, and our speakers will share their experiences on designing and implementing a survey that includes SOGI variables, methodological approaches around sampling, data collection and weighting, ethical considerations in response to SOGI, and some analysis of our survey data. As Naledi has mentioned, our session will run as follows. We will have the presentation portion first and then a Q&A segment following that. We will also run a Mentimeter poll during the Q&A. Regarding our first speaker, please note that after providing his contribution to the session, Dr. Roberts can at maximum take 2 questions directed at him, as he'll leave right after due to a prior engagement. For the remaining speakers, any questions for them can be left for the end of the presentation portion of the session. You can, however, leave your questions in the chat box during the session as the speakers present. So our speakers are as follows. The first is Dr. Benjamin Roberts, who's a research director and coordinator of the South African Social Attitude Survey at Human Sciences Research Council. Our second speaker is Mpho Buntshe, executive director at the South African Higher Education Queer Alliance. And our final speaker is our very own Sthembiso Pollen Mkhize, who is a junior researcher and co-investigator of the Quality of Life Survey at Gauteng City-Region Observatory. And so going into our first speaker, being Dr. Benjamin Roberts, he, as I already mentioned, is a research director and acting strategic lead in the Developmental Capable and Ethical State Research Division at the Human Sciences Research Council. He has a PhD in social sociology and labor studies from Rhodes University. He has coordinated the South African Social Attitude Survey series since its inception in 2003, as well as survey series on elections for the Electoral Commission of South Africa and financial literacy for the Financial Sector Control Authority. He was responsible for the fielding of the SASAS Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity module on behalf of the Other Foundation in 2015 and 2016. Recent publications include the Springer book, Quality of Life and Human Wellbeing in Sub-Saharan Africa, Prospects for Future Happiness with Valerie Moller. So Dr. Roberts, over to you.
Much, Vuyiswa, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to address this important topic today. I'm going to just share my screen. I've got a very short set of slides that I'd just like to put up. So if you, Vuyiswa, if you could just confirm that it's displaying.
Yes, it is.
Just going to kick it into presentation mode. Thanks. So really what I wanted to talk about is in line with the theme of Seminar 3 is really about practical efforts to try and implement sexual orientation, gender identity surveys, representative surveys around this theme. The example I'm going to give is the one that was mentioned in the biosketch, which is from the HSRC's South African Social Attitude Survey series. It is nationally representative of the public age 16 years and older. It's conducted on an annual basis using a random probability sample. We try and achieve, well, we draw a sample of about 3,500 respondents a year with an expectation of a minimum response rate of about 75% on aggregate. And adheres to all the sort of standard confidentiality and peer type protocols. And the data collection is down this period, which is unfortunately why I have to dash shortly after this presentation. We're doing the inception of the annual survey this year's round. I think that the sort of starting point is a tendency, certainly in South African survey, but probably true in many countries globally, a general when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, fundamental over-reliance on single item indicators. So most examinations through surveying that's been undertaken has tended to look at, looking at attitudes towards LGBTIQ+, has tended to rely on these single item measures. Yes, they might have been repeated over a long sweep of time in some cases, but they are either prone to a certain particular thematic bias, and they don't really give a sense of the nuance of those attitudes, beliefs, and reported behaviors in these countries. And South Africa certainly has traditionally fallen into this camp. There's also a need to identify different conceptual and thematic aspects. So I think, as I was saying, we need to move beyond this single item construct. We need to think about theoretical grounding of what we're doing. We need to look at different concepts that relate specifically to the local context, and those have largely been overlooked. So this is an example of kind of what we've fielded, and it's, as I said, it's prone to the kind of biases that I referred to. So the one that's probably had the longest inclusion is one that was been in every year for almost 20 years of surveying in this series, which is around sense of the permissiveness of same-sex sexual relations. So it's got a very narrow focus. So the kind of attitudes that we get in response have a tendency in part to reflect that particular emphasis. Also, one that was included at the request of Professor Vasu Reddy, probably in the late 2010, so late 2000s, was this one, and it was one that's been fielded in the European social surveys. So general sort of acceptance measure that's not rooted in sexual relations. It's about freedom. So that we've been fielding as well, for the, as I say, continuously on an annual basis since about 2012. And then the other cases where it's been more ad hoc international inclusion. So there's one on parenting that's been in, as well as views on same-sex marriage that have been in a module on family and changing gender roles. So that's really prior to the work that we did with the other foundation. This was kind of it. Not that it's without any form of utility. So for instance, if we look at patterns from 2003 to 2021 on the same-sex sexual relations measure, it doesn't look like it's obviously, if you go back to the left-hand side, you see very strongly entrenched views. But as we move into the 2010s, we start seeing very subtle, very slow patterns of change. It's difficult to pick it up clearly on this slide, but this one gives you a better sense of it. So this is looking at the polar ends of that scale, those that say it's always wrong in the orange, and the percentage of South Africans that say it's not wrong at all. So we can see that there has been some signs of movement, and that certainly a level of movement that seems to be gaining momentum, but it has been slow to come, and it's still on average quite a negative aggregate view. But this is partly, we are very concerned about that narrow focus. But just to say, it does show some subtle changes on that's framed around same-sex sexual relations. On the freedom one, we see a similar pattern of movement that's occurring. Yes, it's fluctuated up and down a bit in the mid-2010s. We are again seeing signs that there is a slow progressive turn happening amongst the public. Obviously, I can't in the scope of this presentation give you a sense of the underlying drivers of those dynamics, but certainly there's issues around generation, around general societal change that are coming through. But really, this is where Pierre actually is part of the reference group for the other foundation work. So I'm really glad he's part of the seminar series. And what this was in around 2015-16, there was a decision that we need to change this. We need to change the way we survey this particular topic. We want to commission work that provides a much deeper empirical resource to enhance our understanding or knowledge base of sexual orientation, gender, and identity, not only in South Africa, but it was we started off with South Africa as the basis for trying to push the way we survey this particular set of topics within across the African continent. So you can see the kind of names that are on the reference group, and Pierre was critical among them. I think one of the key things with this kind of surveying approach, and it's something I would advocate for very strongly, is a strong conceptually grounded approach, and that's what the reference group really pushed for. We had we started off with a workshop where we really thrashed around what do we want to see in this module, and particularly what do we perceive the relationships between different conceptual constructs to be. So this is a very stylized summation of what we came out of after quite a lot of contestation and debate and having to make hard choices in what ultimately got fielded in the module. But it was looking at particularly various factors that we thought would shape those personal attributes. It included things such as personal experience of sexual orientation and gender identity. It was about issues of contact, the whole contact hypothesis, issues around understanding or knowledge, and also the sort of issues around moral framing and sources, including religion, tradition, culture. And that in turn would shape different aspects of attitudes, and by extension, reported behavior, as well as issues around policy preferences. So we really spent quite a lot of time thinking about that and thinking what would apply best to the South African and indeed the African case. I'm going to have to sort of put a little spotlight on bits and pieces in the next few minutes. So one I want to touch on is issues about direct questions in the background variables that we include in the survey around self-identity. This is something that a lot of surveying houses around internationally, including official statistical agencies globally, have tried to engage with. This is one that's included, which really is asking the respondent to describe how they think of themselves. So, and what we see is that the total percentage of the population that identified as LGBT at that point in time, in the mid-2010s, was 1.4%. So this is, at the time, was within the range observed in a range of countries around the world. So one thing to just bear in mind, if we advocate for this in our provocation, if we advocate for this as part of a standard set that gets included in a range of surveys of different types around the country, just know that the kind of reporting, yes, it's probably changed in the last 5-7 years, but the kind of reporting is 1 to 2%. Certainly it was 5 in that period of 2015-2016. So if you're doing a sample of say 3,000, you're not going to get a particularly large number to do in-depth empirical analysis with. You might, if you go to stats that say the particularly large surveys, then yes, we would. but for the kind of representative samples that the HSLC does, GCRO has a particularly bigger sample, so that might work better than it would for the HSLC ones, but that needs to be factored in. But we got much higher shares reporting when we looked at gender non-conformity, so that was much larger shares. So if you were to add up those that are from this slide, both for men and women that were reported gender non-conformity, you're probably up around the 10% range. So that it does present, even on smaller samples such as ours, enough cases to do quite in-depth analysis on. Particularly if we're doing routine surveying every year or a couple of years, then you could easily get quite a big sample to do some really important new fields of research around sexual orientation, gender identity, using the self-identity type of item. So I think that needs to be part of the provocation. I'll return to it in a minute or two. The other ones is obviously just casting a bit of a spotlight on one or two of the kind of attitudinal aspects of what we looked at, just to say that it really, this spoke to the other foundation work, really spoke to the importance of moving beyond that narrow moral framing around same-sex sexual relations, and it spoke to various complexities of these topics. So we would see, for instance, I've just put a few examples from the report, and the report is available on the other foundation's website. For instance, 55% said that they would accept a gay family member. So despite that quite harsh sort of views around the morality of same-sex sexual relations, we see quite a much more accepting view of a gay family member. We also saw that around half of South Africans believe that so half of South Africans believe that gay people should have the same human rights as other citizens. We may want that to be far, far higher, but it's something we can build on. It creates these sort of critical openings that allows us to build a sort of campaigning and lobbying around, and that's something that the other foundation really wanted to do with this research. Also, what we saw is 52% believed that gay and lesbian people should be included in their culture and tradition as well. So it just shows that despite large shares still voicing, although it's changed, as I showed earlier on, it is starting to shift on those same-sex sexual relation attitudes more broadly. When we talk about a broader framing, we see these spaces that we can actually, through continued provocation, continued lobbying, try and motivate to try and mobilize and get those figures much higher. I'll skip probably over this one. This is just more of the same type of, this is the same-sex marriage figures, just showing there has been quite a big shift in a fairly short period of time in our survey. But the other thing that this kind of conceptually grounded in-depth modules can do is really start testing the kind of models that schematic I put up earlier, really unpacking those and looking at some of those drivers, the predictors, and also using that to inform the sort of on-the-ground work that gets done to try and educate the public and push for further progressive change. So this includes issues of contact, which was proven as quite significant, issues around religiosity, issues of age in particular, and so on. So that, there are a range of other ones I could give, but it just shows that the model that we put in place to test a lot of those hypotheses did prove true. Also moving through to the behavioral side, I think this is something that Mark Professor talked about in the Pink Line, that book that he wrote, where he was talking particularly about the behavioral tendencies, both in terms of reported past violence, but also the propensity to violence against gender non-conforming women and also to gay men. So it allows us to move just beyond the attitude and also pull through those background characteristics to attitudes and through to behavior, as well as to policy preferences. So that I want to end with two slides. One is coming back to the idea, the purpose of the seminar series is about what next, big question mark. Firstly, we need to advocate quite strongly for further inclusion of this type of research in the multi-topic surveys that are conducted countrywide. It might be through the National Statistical Agency, StatsSA, it might be the GCRO and SASAS, and all, a range of other surveys that are known to be high quality. We did surveying in 2015-16. We haven't gone back in the last 5 or 6 years to repeat the model. So it's probably overdue for a repeat. Fortunately, what has happened in the interim is the work has started moving beyond South African borders. So it has gone to Malawi, Eswatini, Botswana. It's about to go to field already in Namibia and Mauritius. So starting to engage, take the idea and the conceptual foundation of what we're doing and adapt it slightly for the different local contexts, but really again with the same kind of end in mind to really understand the sort of different openings, the different critical spaces around which further lobbying can take place. Funding is going to be the bugbear in the room. I think in order to ensure in a fairly routine ways, sexual orientation, gender identity modules, we're going to have to try and leverage a bit of funding. Otherwise, I don't think it's really going to be placed. I mean, we can, I think the kind of provocations that are needed, that I think there's the non-negotiables, inclusion of a standard set of self-identity items in surveys. But I think we want to go beyond that. We really want to go beyond that to have these large in-depth surveys, and at least every few years. So that's so the frequency, and that's something that I've mentioned towards the bottom of the slide, really needs to be factored in. How best can we address the underrepresentation? As I said, if we're talking 1 to 2% disclosing, and then there are many reasons why it might not be higher, because if a stranger knocks on your door and wants to do a survey, there are various concerns about disclosing your sexual orientation and gender identity. So I think, how do we overcome the number problem, small numbers problem, to allow further meaningful analysis? Is there oversampling? It's very difficult to do that. So there might need to be specialized surveys that field the same type of questions, and then to allow comparative analysis to some of the other national surveys that are done. But also harmonization is crucial. I think we're all experimenting with different measures. I think part of what needs to happen is we need to almost come together and say, what do we want the measures, non-negotiable measures, to be in official surveys, in other representative surveys that big surveying houses are doing around the country? We need to come together and actually put forward a set of proposed items so that we can actually harmonize and compare findings across our surveys, and do that. That needs to happen much more than is currently underway. And the other thing is the comparative. So the more of the type that research that the other foundation is sponsoring, I think it's, they've done a phenomenal job in terms of coming together to make these 5 or 6 country surveys happen. But how do we go to scale with that is the next thing we really need to reflect on, and not just once off. It needs to be, as I said earlier, it needs to be done in a routine way. So my final slide is really, I think that, and it'll be interesting to hear what colleagues say, but I think we have still a fairly poor track record, but at least we have baselines on conceptually grounded, in-depth surveying on these topics. But the majority, and this is my lament, the majority of survey-based research still remains really, really thin on content. And it applies even to my own survey series. So I need to self-reflect more, I think, about how to address that and make sure it becomes more regularly included. So I think that brings through to you know, I've mentioned it several times now, this need for this position paper or the provocation that can emanate from the seminar series. It really needs to lobby in a very strong way for greater representation, for greater harmonization, and moving beyond the ad hoc way in which surveys in South Africa and beyond have addressed these issues. And we need to make sure, and I think this is a conversation amongst people that are working on the, you know, with big surveys. You know, we need to talk more amongst ourselves about how to interlink, how to harmonize, and make sure that we in our practice crowd in the kind of content that is needed to do justice to where there has been underrepresentation. So thanks very much. That was my short input for the day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. There is a question here from Sbongile, and they ask, how was LGBT percentage found from these statistics as presented here? Sorry, you're on mute. Dr. Roberts, could you hear me? I don't know if you're
Sorry,
responding.
just having a
Oh, there you go.
technical problem, voice. Sorry, back. I didn't quite hear the question. How do we capture the LGBTIQ? Is that what was said? I didn't quite hear the comment.
The question was, how was LGBT percentage found from these statistics as presented here?
Okay, so it was actually included as a direct question so people could self-identify. But that comes, as I was saying, with a whole set of caveats and limitations. If you go and ask, as I said, we do a random sample. So as I said, we're gearing up for our annual round of surveying. We're going to go and knock on 3,500 doors. We ask the people to self-identify, but the problem with that is that strangers walk into your house. How comfortable would someone necessarily feel? So I think our statistics are significant underrepresentation, probably. So I think what would be good to have as part of the conversation is about how best to do this. Is it best to do it through a closed envelope method on those kind of questions, you know, ways that preserve the confidentiality and even the anonymity of response between an interviewer in a face-to-face way asking a question of this type. So I think GCRO has done quite a bit of work of that type of sensitive surveying, and I think we could learn quite a bit from their own experiences with doing that and trying to overcome some of the potential barriers of disclosure. But it was a direct question, and you know, it had a range of categories and others specify and so on. So people were allowed to self-define. We also had open-ended questions that people could fill in. So we used several different approaches.
Okay, thank you. I see Melinda also has a question Pierre answered. Melinda, are you satisfied with Pierre's question? I mean, with Pierre's answer, or would you like to hear from Dr. Roberts as well?
I'm really satisfied. Thank you. I don't want to hold you up, Ben.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, and all the best with your other prior engagements.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Oh, sorry. All right. So up next is our second speaker, being Mpho Buntshe, who is a human rights activist, queer scholar, thought leader, gender and political activist. Buntshe has over 19 years experience working as a community mobilizer and advocate for, amongst others, the LGBTIQ+ community. Buntshe was selected as the first gay affirming member of the SRC at the University of Johannesburg 3 years after its merger. Buntshe became central in highlighting the plight of queer students, and through his presidency at the UJ Liberati, UJ's first LGBTIQ+ student society, he led in its second administration after its launch. He then led the advancement of the queer agenda that saw the institution become an ally of this work. Buntshe is the founder of the annual Simon Ngoli Memorial Lecture, now in its 9th year, and has been delivered in collaboration with institutions such as UJ, UP, Stellenbosch University, and University of South Africa. Buntshe is set to publish his book titled The Spicy Anthology, with the foreword by former Constitutional Court Justice Judge Edwin Cameron. Buntshe is also passionate about youth diplomatic engagement and is a fellow of the 2018 Mandela Washington Fellowship, the 2017 Young Diplomats Forum, and was also named Goodwill Ambassador for LGBT+ rights by the International Lesbian and Gay Association. In 2019, Buntshe addressed a gathering of 500 queer policymakers and legislators in Washington, D.C. during the Victory Institute World Conference for LGBTIQ+ leaders. He holds a BA in journalism and BA honors in communication theory, both from UJ. Buntshe is an energetic scholar who has written extensively on the history of same-sex desiring, queer representation, as well as visibility. He is the founder and CEO of the soon-to-launch South African Higher Education Queer Alliance, serves as the National Coordinator of the ANC Women's League LGBTIQ+ Desk, National Head of Communications for the Embrace Diversity Movement, and works on a full-time basis as the Project and Communications Associate for Access Chapter 2, where he is responsible for driving a project on the outlawing of conversion practices in South Africa. In 2022, Buntshe was named amongst the top 200 young South Africans by the Mail and Guardian. And Buntshe recently returned from the African Commission Human and People Rights 73rd Ordinary Session, where he shared data on conversion practices in South Africa. So, Buntshe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. So I think you would have said a mouthful in terms of introduction. I'll just jump straight into speaking about the study we did a couple of years ago in partnership with the Institute for Inclusive Society. So the study actually arose out of this idea that the LGBTQ was so marginalized and disenfranchised to a point that COVID-19 would expose these inequalities, issues of access to healthcare, issues of access to employment opportunities and the economy really came on top as some of the factors that led us to undertaking this study, more so to understand and paint a picture of the current status quo for the LGBTQ+ community. We titled the study Assessing the Democratic Consciousness, Social Cohesion and Integration and the Life Experiences of the LGBTIQ+ community. Like I said, this was a partnership between myself as a scholar in my personal capacity, with great passion to actually raise questions, important questions about the political position and need of the LGBTQ+ community. So how access is given through the creation of queer inclusive policies and legislation would be guided by the level of research that we offer to government. So that was really the inspiration around doing this work. Now, the survey was undertaken over the very difficult period that became a watershed year for not only South Africa, but the global community, during COVID-19 hard lockdown. So that alone was an incredible limitation to our work. We opened up the survey for a period between the 10th and 22nd of June 2020. And you'd remember this was when we were in the actual lockdown. And what we wanted to do was to assess, amongst others, the lived experiences of the LGBTIQ against various public policy objectives. Now, given the survey was conducted during COVID-19 lockdown, it included appraisal of the impact that regulations had on the LGBTIQ plus community. And we know that it really, more than anything, exacerbated the already difficult situation for the LGBTIQ plus community, which is marginalized in terms of accessing some of these services on a daily basis. We make examples with just accessing an opportunity to open a case at a police station. A trans woman would be taken from helter to skelter before they can even open that case. These leads to issues of secondary victimization, homophobia and transphobia. And these came out a lot during the survey. At the level of conceptualizing, I proposed a study looking at 7 important pillars that articulate the peculiar policy nuances that disenfranchises the community when it comes to access to services. And these pillars included education and youth development, access to healthcare and services, safety and security, psychosocial services, access to essential services, homelessness and housing access, job creation, employment, and access to the economy. And the last issue that we had to look at was around queer migrants and asylum seekers, which really formed part of our overall struggle and burden as LGBTIQ plus activists. So in partnership with the Institute, we undertook this study to document the realities of the LGBTQ community so that we can come up with strong recommendations to offer government and other stakeholders. In our methodology, we benchmarked other work on the population specific to the country, and we used the baseline or the existing baseline to understand our numbers. It was important to understand the LGBTQ population as it is currently estimated so that we can actually sample ourselves. And key to note was how the census or the idea around LGBTQ statistics was missing. And it was so difficult to map out, issues around SOGI and demographic dynamics. It became necessary to actually even note it as a flag that there's a greater need to create a census that speaks specific to the LGBTQ plus community. And this is the current work that I'm undertaking with Access Chapter 2. Our source on the population was based on the UK Home Office report, which is also problematic, how we depend a lot on Western research to actually explain issues of LGBTQ in Africa. We also flagged that as one of the problems. But we had to come very close to home, and we found a report by the Other Foundation and the Human Sciences Research Council, which revealed a number really close to that of the UK Home Office, estimating the LGBTQ plus community to be about 530,000 at the time of the study. It was important to also undertake or to understand the population in order to sample for our study. We had to use electronic measures as it was hard lockdown during COVID-19. We received data from about 288 valid responses drawn from across 9 provinces. Most of these responses came from the LGBTIQ plus community, with most identifying as bisexual. The Institute uses a 95% confidence level and 5% margin of error in determining their confidence in their studies. And for this study in particular, our confidence level was at 95%, with a slight lower margin of the error of 6%. So 204 responses for a population or exceeding 100,000 would result in a margin error of 7%. The 288 that we gathered in this study would suggest a margin error of midway 6%. So in a way, we were confident with the numbers that we got at the backdrop of the 530,000 population that is estimated. Our limitations included the major issue when you are working within the digital space, digital divide, looking specifically on data scarcity and connectivity. Whilst proactive steps have been taken to ensure data integrity, and all indications are that data was beyond reproach, we could not ignore the possibility, however, of data manipulation. We focused on key questions in the study that looked, amongst others, the demographic nature of the respondents, where they come from, how do they fit into the economic or socio-economic issues, their education level. The other question was around questions relating to constitutional and democratic rights, the consciousness around how respondents understood themselves at the backdrop of their constitutional rights and the Constitution of South Africa, especially where it protects and recognizes sexual orientation. The other questions were around social cohesion and integration, mainly on how respondents viewed themselves at the backdrop of their role and positions within societies and communities where they live. Other questions looked at attitude changes in South Africa, particularly looking at the period between 1994 and the current status quo, to understand how attitudes have changed over time when it comes to how communities, particularly church institutions, traditional institutions, would view the LGBTQ plus community. Other questions were around understanding family environment. It was important to understand family environment as it pertains to issues of understanding conversion practices or conversion therapy, which in other studies, specifically a study recently conducted by Access Chapter 2, indicate that conversion practices are mainly started or erupt out of family situations or family environments. Other questions were around healthcare. We had to understand access to healthcare, whether it was problematic and how far it has gotten since the COVID-19 lockdown. And other questions were centered around COVID-19 impact on individuals accessing some of the key services. Program director, please, if you can just indicate to me, like, how much time do I still have?
I think you can do with it, but like 5 to 8 minutes.
Okay. We had very intentional recommendations, and these recommendations were mainly around focusing or identifying specific government departments and stakeholders so that we can influence policy change or policy discussions. The first recommendation was specific to the Department of Public Administration, calling for a design and implementation of an awareness program aimed at sensitizing the public service on issues of the rights of the LGBTIQ plus community. especially when it comes to issues of receiving equal and quality services from all civil servants. Also called on the department to develop a reporting and monitoring mechanism aimed at ensuring, amongst others, adherence to constitutional and legislative obligations of public officials. The second recommendation was around ensuring that government, amongst other things, promote education and youth development, access to healthcare and healthcare services, safety and security and psychosocial services, access of essential services, homelessness and access to housing as priority issues for provincial governments, job creation, LGBTIQ migration and asylum seeking as priority to protect the LGBTIQ plus community. The third recommendation was around what we saw as one of the burning issues and what we identified as priority for the Department of Health, where the study indicated that the majority, about over 60% of our respondents reported psychosocial challenges and a lack of places to go to access psychosocial support. So this came up as one of the key issues that really required us to call the Department of Health to, amongst others, gain full understanding of the causes and potential remedial policies and interventions that could be designed to mitigate against acute disorders that came out in the study. So the study is available online and can be accessed. It's simple to understand. We hope that it will help institutions of higher learning. It will help institutions that want to understand lived experiences of the LGBTIQ plus community, but over and above that, to also encourage scholars, academics, to invest more in the creation and development of new research. One of our greatest challenges in South Africa as a context is the scarcity of research that paints our realities as the LGBTQI in South Africa. So I think that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Mpho. I think I don't want to make any comments right now because we might run out of time. So I'm just going to go into introducing our final speaker. Our final speaker being our very own Sthembiso Pollen Mkhize, who I already said previously is a junior researcher at the Gauteng City-Region Observatory. In late 2019, he obtained his master's in population studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and joined the GCRO as a research intern for the GCRO's Quality of Life Survey of 2020 to 2021 to provide support to all project phases from planning and preparation, implementation, fieldwork, quality control, analysis, write-up, and dissemination. He currently leads the Queering Social Survey research project and remains the co-investigator for the Quality of Life Survey. He has a strong interest in LGBTQ plus youth, health, utilization of healthcare services, quality of life and well-being, experiences of violence, mental health, sexuality space, and survey design and implementation. So Sthembiso, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Vizwa. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen from your side?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm very delighted to be able to share with you today some of my experiences as part of a team that's designed and implemented the GCRO's Quality of Life 6. The title of my presentation is Filling Data Blind Spots, Recognizing Sexuality and Gender Identity. I think it is safe for me to say that the whole idea of starting the Queering Social Survey research project came from the importance and the need for the GCRO to self-reflect on the gender and sexual or romantic attraction questions that were introduced for the first time in the 6th iteration of the survey to inform us, to help us inform the appropriate use of the survey results. So I will start by providing a brief introduction to the Quality of Life survey as a whole, and then I'll then share some insights into how we conducted the 6th iteration of the survey. Then the rest of the presentation will cover the approaches around ethics, data collection, and weighting of Qual 6 data sets. And then I'll share some strengths and limitations of these variables, and then some analysis of the data. So since it was first run in 2009, the Quality of Life survey, or QUAL survey, has become one of South Africa's largest and longest running social surveys. A new iteration of the survey has followed every 2 years. In each iteration, randomly sampled adults from 18 years and older are interviewed at their homes. Since 2011, each survey has included data from well over 10,000 respondents living in each and every ward in Gauteng. Our sample is designed to ensure that our data is representative of the adult population at the ward level, municipal and provincial levels. Over time, our methodology has remained broadly consistent, and because we also know exactly where each interview is conducted, we are able to map our data in many different ways. And this means that much of our data is comparable over time, and it can be used to monitor progress and identify new challenges as they arise. So the latest QUAL survey was conducted in 2021, and it was granted ethics approval by the VET Human Research Ethics Committee. The final data sets include 13,616 randomly sampled respondents, and their distribution across the province can be seen on the map. In each of the province's 9 municipalities, we interviewed a minimum of 600 respondents, and substantially larger numbers in more heavily populated municipalities. The interviews were conducted in each and every of the 529 wards in Gauteng, with a minimum of 20 interviews in each. So our data has been used by the local and provincial government, academics, students, researchers, consultants, civil society, and the interested members of the public. Some of our outputs include the map of demand, vignettes, data briefs, occasional papers, and research reports. These outputs and the data itself have assisted the government for policy priorities and to assess performance, and it has become an invaluable resource for better planning and policy implications, as well as for further discussions. Now I will share how the Quality of Life 6 survey contributed to the efforts of reimagining the measurements of sex, gender, and sexuality. So QUAL 6 aimed to balance the questions that we've asked before with the new content responding to our current data needs, covering a range of themes, including new themes on COVID-19 and the experiences of violence. In the diagram that you see, you can see what proportion of the questionnaire was dedicated to each theme based on the size of each thematic block. The questionnaire was digitized using a Kobo toolbox application, and it included 214 questions and was translated from English into 8 additional languages to ensure consistent collection of data among a diverse population. The mean duration of the field worker administered interview was 35 minutes. So for the first time in Qual 6, a separate series of self-complete questions were introduced to the survey, and the mean duration of the section was 3 minutes. This new content provides essential adult population-based estimates of queer population, exposure to childhood abuse, past year physical violence and rape, and as well as intimate partner violence in Gauteng. So collecting the Qual 6 data was a massive undertaking, especially during a complicated period of COVID-19. However, in order to ensure high quality data collection and full adherence to ethical requirements and COVID-19 protocols, our field team members participated in a minimum of 5 full days of in-person training, which was run by the service provider, Geospace International, in collaboration with the core Qual team from the GCRO. Given the inclusion of the sensitive violence-related and SOGI-related questions in the questionnaire, a dedicated training module was also developed to provide field workers with applicable skills to facilitate the completion of these sensitive questions when necessary. We also shared a small folded pamphlet with a list of organizations to respondents who participated in the sensitive section in case they needed counseling. So before full-scale data collection, an infield pilot conducted in early October 2020 provided a useful opportunity to test and refine all aspects of data collection and training. And then full-scale data collection began in late October 2020 and was concluded before the dead wave of COVID-19 in May 2021. Respondents who gave consent to participate to the survey main questionnaire were also given an opportunity to complete the sensitive section. Those who gave consent to complete the sensitive section were handed over the tablets after the field worker administered questionnaire to complete the questions on their own. Quality control also received close attention throughout the data collection period, with the data subjected to a range of checks and verification processes. On completion of data collection, the data was weighted against the 2021 municipal population estimates by race and gender. Now I will share how the Qual 6 survey strives to fill the data blind spots. So as mentioned in the previous slides, the first 5 iterations of the Qual survey has observed the respondent sex or gender in a binary approach, which has been captured as male or female by field worker observation. This was retained in Qual 6, where we followed both the binary approach in the main questionnaire and the non-binary approach in the self-complete section, as respondents were asked to select their gender and sexual or romantic attraction in the confidential section. Based on a series of pilots respondents were provided with 4 options: male, female, gender diverse, and prefer not to answer. These questions were introduced to the survey to contribute to the effort of collecting SOGI data and to also contribute to the urgent need of having a data for the LGBTIQ+ population for policy purposes and to advance the core survey design and instruments for data collection. So the confidential section was completed by 11,768 individuals, or 86% of all survey respondents. The gender question, which is 15.1, can tell us how many respondents identify their gender as male, female, or gender diverse. And the result shows that 0.2% of Gauteng residents identify as gender diverse, and another 0.2% preferred not to say anything. Sorry. And then in terms of attraction, we see that respondents were fully expressive of who they are attracted to. However, in order to understand these figures properly for analysis purposes and to avoid sample size limitations, there may be a need to combine the 2 variables and record them into one to get a sense of figures for sexual orientation or sexuality. It is important to note that gender identity and sexual orientation are 2 completely different constructs that should be kept separate. And our data can already tell us the figures for gender identity. Now, I'll show you how we can explore how to record the 2 variables on gender and attraction to get the figures for sexual orientation or sexuality. So my first step to recording the 2 variables was to understand the definitions of categories that fall under sexual orientation. For instance, a gay person may refers to someone who is sexually or romantically attracted to people with same sex or gender. In this case, respondents who selected male in 15.1 and selected male again in 15.2 were categorized as A. The same method was followed to identify respondents whose sexuality may be lesbian, pansexual, and or queer. Unfortunately, the questions were single select, hence we were not able to identify respondents whose sexuality may be bisexual. It is also worth mentioning that regardless of how one codes these categories, it is important to have a little note that findings presented are about attraction, not identity, because respondents may express same-sex attraction, but does not mean they identify as gay or pansexual, lesbian, or queer. Hence, I also believe that we cannot use the universal LGBTIQ+ abbreviation to report this data, because it does not tell us if there are people who are bisexual, transgender, or intersex. However, the most appropriate terminology that we may use to refer to these respondents would be sexual minority or queer, which are terms that have been widely used to reference the members of the LGBTIQ+ community. Also, I believe it is inclusive even for analysis because it includes persons not specifically referenced by the identities listed in the LGBTIQ+ abbreviation. Some of the strengths to using this data include its contribution to the efforts of rethinking the measurements of sexual orientation and gender identity. The data itself allows us to analyze and understand the experiences of the experiences of certain members of the LGBTIQ community. Filling data blind spots is also crucial to end the harm that violence causes towards the LGBTIQ+ individuals across Gauteng and also across the country. The sexuality data can still be grouped and analyzed to depict the experiences of the whole LGBTIQ+ community. In terms of the limitations, some of the members of the LGBTIQ+ community may still feel excluded from the survey. Therefore, there is a need to refine and rethink how best we should ask about sex, gender, and sexuality. The binary sex data still remains key to weighting the final data sets because there is no benchmarking data from the census of people for non-binary sex or gender. The issue of terminology, when we refer to respondents as male or female, are normally used as a biological description of sex. So there may be a need to sort of rethink how we can refine the categories for sex, gender, and sexuality, maybe according to the gender-bread person, which was explained nicely by Dr. Kala Sutherland in the previous session of the seminar series. The SOGI data is not comparable to the previous iterations of the pulse survey. Hence, this is a start to include these questions for future iterations. The way we ask about sex at the beginning of the survey has also shown that there are discrepancies between interviewer recorded sex and the self-reported gender. And this may be a strength for the next iteration of the pulse survey to rethink how best we can ask these questions to avoid the errors or the discrepancies. Now I'll share some preliminary analysis of this data. So some of the analysis from the Qual6 data shows that sexual minority respondents are more likely to experience different forms of violence compared to the heterosexual respondents. And we see that 7.4 of Gauteng respondents reported having experienced sexual abuse during their childhood. However, this was higher at 16.4% for sexual minority respondents who reported childhood sexual abuse compared to the 9.9% of heterosexual respondents. Similarly, for rape, intimate partner violence, and physical trauma, respondents who are sexual minorities had high levels of exposure during the past year compared to heterosexual respondents. And then in terms of the risk of depression, we see that the percentage of respondents at high risk of depression is higher at 40% for sexual minority respondents compared to the 37% of heterosexual respondents. This suggests that filling data blind spots is crucial to understand the disparities within the entire population, allowing us, including the government and policymakers, an opportunity to end and address the harm that violence and other issues cause to the members of the LGBTIQ+ community. There are many other data possibilities to using Qual6 data, and I've provided some of the examples, which include analyzing the data by sex, gender, and sexuality, exploring the levels of satisfaction in services and government, exploring accessibility and use of services, including healthcare facilities. This data is freely available under CC by 4.0 license from the UCT's Data First service. You can also access our website to see more work the GCRO does, and you can find the full report, which provides rich detail across a range of 12 topics from the survey data, and a shorter reports focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic. If you're interested in any of these options, please do let us know. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you so much, Sthembiso, for your contribution as well. And I think what all of our speakers have touched on in one form or another is that in as much as we may want quantitative data to help support such identities overall through appropriate infrastructure or legislation and the execution thereof, it should be done at least it should be in a way that is very sensitive and very careful, as is rightfully demanded from the researcher. So now we're going to run a Mentimeter poll, and I'd like to ask Naledi to please share the screen for the Mentimeter question to get the poll going while people type up their questions in the chat box, as now we have entered our Q&A session. So should you have any questions, please do type them up and also participate in the polls for today. While you are participating in the poll, there is a question from Tara for Sthembiso specifically, it appears. And the question is, did you do the analysis on whether those are statistically significant differences? This is with regards to violence, the analysis on violence.
Thanks, Tara. If I remember correctly, we did run some analysis on the statistical significance differences when we were preparing the launch reports last year, but I think we'll need to revisit that because there has been some changes while I was working on this data. So I'm happy to share that as I keep on working on the data.
Okay, there's a question by Pierre. Pierre, please.
Hi, Sthembiso. Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to pick up on the options people could use for indicating who they're attracted to. If I heard you correctly, you were saying they could only choose one option of male or female or gender diverse or prefer not to answer. Is that correct?
Yes. So the gender question and the attraction question, respondents were only given an opportunity to only select one category. So it was single select instead of a multi-select.
Because I mean, you addressed the question of, I guess people couldn't say I'm attracted to both men and women. If I was answering that, I might interpret the term gender diverse as I'm attracted to both men and women. Not necessarily I'm attracted to people who are gender diverse. Or am I making it too complicated?
Yeah, please repeat that because I'm a bit lost.
So yeah, so when you gave people the option that they're attracted to other people who are gender diverse, you're meaning I'm saying if I was filling out that option, I might choose to select that option to indicate I'm attracted to both men and women, rather than someone who identifies as gender diverse.
Okay.
So for me, there's a little bit of a conceptual slipperiness maybe in that usage there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And like I said, this is the first time these
Yeah.
questions were included in the quality of life survey.
Right.
So we are happy to make refinements as we, do the next iteration of the survey. And yeah, thank you for raising that.
It's just the thoughts. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has a view on that in the room, but it's fantastic that you included these variables at all. And I think the violence connection is really interesting. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right. I don't know if Nicholas is still with us because they shared a question that Marcel answered. So Nicholas, are you satisfied with Marcel's answer, or would you like to hear more from the speakers? Is Nicholas still here? Okay. Doesn't seem like they're here, but I don't know if any of the speakers would like to have a go at it, because I'd like to hear from you guys. So Nicholas asked, given the government's focus on gender-based violence, are there harmonized measures of violence in LGBTI populations in South Africa? They're not aware of any, but we can't simply use the same ones developed for heterosexual women, for example. So that's open to the floor, so anybody can take that question.
From my side, just to say, like in the data, when we wanted to understand demographics, family situations, and environment, what could have came up mostly is what we termed, or what is termed in the space, intimate partner violence, which is problematic as well in terms of having to report. Law enforcement would always see it or define it as or within the confines of gender-based violence. So first, they would view it in the gender binary perspective, that for violence or to take place, or for them to recognize it as state, it should be between a man and a woman. So these has been some of the key issues that I think even with the current and ongoing summit on gender-based violence are raising, to say the definition of gender-based violence need to be broadened to remove the gender binary perspective or lens, because it makes the documenting and recording of cases that are specific to that extent not recorded or not even recognized.
Thank you, Mpho. And before I ask anything else, I just want to make sure, because Albakwe asked if the presentations could be made available to everyone. So I don't know if that's something that, I don't know if that's an option for this session as well as the previous sessions that we've had.
Yes, I will send an email sometime next week with all the presentations and the link to YouTube.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. If not, we could leave the session now, since considering that we only have 6 minutes left therein. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand now. I'll give you a good 10 seconds maybe to think it through, and then I'll say something afterwards if no question arises. Okay, it looks like there are no questions, which then brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much, everyone who participated. Your presence and contributions are immensely appreciated. And a special word of thanks to our speakers, to whom we owe our time to, I suppose, because they've shared some great insights with us. Please note that our fourth and last installment of this session, of this seminar series rather, titled Research Policy Interface, Production, Dissemination, and Use of LGBTIQ plus data, will occur 2 weeks from now on the 17th of November, still at the same time as this run, from 11 until 12:30. We hope to see you there too as well. And I'd like to wish everybody a good day. Please take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a fab day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.